Alright, let's talk about sword edges. Not so much about how sharp they should be this time, but rather where they should be sharp. Should there be a difference? Should you sharpen them all the way? So first I'll tell you how I personally like to sharpen my blades, and I'll give you some other considerations. Now, this is not meant to make any statement about how they were historically. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just my personal preference is I like to sharpen them from the tip to about half of the blade. The rest I don't even bother with most of the time. Why? Because this part I don't need for my purposes. And when testing the blade or when doing cutting practice, I cut with this part. The top third is called the weak of the blade, and the bottom third is called the strong. This has to do with leverage. Somebody can control your blade a lot better if they put their strong against your weak, because then the leverage works against you, and vice versa. But for cutting, it's the other way around. You want to cut with this part because that's the most powerful cut, most effective. And it depends on the blade shape as well. Like the sweet spot is on a blade like this that tapers a lot, is quite a bit lower than on a blade that stays wide all throughout. So for this one I actually went a little past half. I sharpened it up until, it's kind of hard to see in this light, but I think until about here. Because just in case, since you impact lower with a sword like this, it's always good to have a little bit extra, just in case you end up a little bit too close. But otherwise, this part I don't cut with. And what I also like to do is leave, in case of a double-edged blade, leave one edge as it is, as it came from the factory, and sharpen the other one. Now this is just for review purposes, so that I can show the difference between the factory edge and my resharpened edge. You could argue for having two different edges for two different purposes. Like one that is very sharp, highly polished, a shaving sharp edge with which you could, cut very cleanly through tatami mats or any kind of soft tissue that would deal with clothing very well, cloth armor in general, and soft tissue light targets, all of that would be excellent for that. And then a somewhat stouter edge with a wider angle on the edge bevel for hewing through bone and dealing with harder, tougher materials in general. Now, this makes sense in theory. In practice, not so much. I mean, if you were in a duel or on the battlefield, now let's actually go with a duel, because battlefield really favors a somewhat sturdier edge anyway. But in a duel, to remember which edge is which at all times, in historical combat, under stress, that just wouldn't be feasible. In your backyard, where you can set up at your own leisure and have time to check, like, where did I put the extra sharp edge on again? Oh yeah, the maker's mark is here, and I put it to the left of the maker's mark. And check out, oh yeah, clearly this is the sharp one, and you can do your thing. That wouldn't be an option in an actual combat. So this is really more for modern purposes. Before I forget, I should clarify, I'm not making any statements about the actual edges on historical blades. I simply don't have enough data on that. It's very difficult to find any information about the edges of historical swords, because the museums usually don't really give you information about that. And even if they did, it's always hard to say how close the edge is to its original state. After several centuries and corrosion and wear and all that, it's most likely not the original edge. So it is pretty difficult to make statements about that anyway. It should be easier to notice any differences in sharpening if one part of the edge was sharpened more thoroughly than another. But again, I haven't seen much evidence of that, so there just isn't really enough data. At least as far as I know. If somebody else has something, absolutely feel free to share it. With a side sword, or especially a rapier, it would make perfect sense to me to just sharpen it halfway down, even in historical combat, because there isn't really going to be too much opportunity to use the bottom edge. In longsword fighting, on the other hand, there are situations where you can absolutely benefit from a sharpened strong of the blade. This is supposed to be a longsword, but I only have one practice sword and longsword in the house right now, so it'll have to do. So if we both come to a bind, and my opponent lifts up their sword to do another cut, I can come in with the false edge here and control. If they just try to strike down, I can easily push that over to the side and I will end up with control of the arms, and I can slice at the same time, which is unpleasant even with a blunt sword, isn't it? Now, here you need quite a lot of the blade. It starts out at the strong of the blade, so again, start out by putting the strong of the blade against the arm. This is what you really need for the extra leverage, and then as you wind down, you notice how you put more of the upper or central part of the blade on the arm. And then if you wanted to disengage, you could just step back and slice, but the better thing at that point is just to remain in control here. And from the other side, lift up, come in, slice. At the same time, these techniques rely mainly on controlling the opponent's limbs, so it's not technically necessary to slice into them to make that work. You can still absolutely control the opponent and end the fight and, you know, execute some other grappling techniques without the need to actually slice deeply. Either way, it definitely helps. A sharp edge will bite into the clothing and the skin and flesh underneath and make it much more difficult for the opponent to draw away or anything. So definitely still can make a argument for the bottom edge being quite sharp in this case. But there are other techniques where you don't really need that, where you can do the slice with the upper part or center part of the blade. If from the bind the opponent tries to roll around to come in with a cut, you can very well step in and use the upper part of the edge and push down and do the slice. If the opponent is weak in the bind, meaning that they don't apply any pressure, you can also wind into it and now put the edge against the neck. So I can now either push or pull, and that's again with the upper part of the edge. And you can also make an argument for leaving the strong of the blade unsharpened. That was done with some sabers, so you can parry with that without any kind of edge damage. But at the same time, since this is not the part that you cut with, edge damage isn't really that big of a deal. In general, it isn't. People very much overestimate sometimes how much of a problem edge damage was in historical combat. I mean, it was a tool to defend your life with. If it gets damaged, so be it. Better, like, you can replace or repair the sword, you cannot replace or repair your arm or your leg or your life. So not that big of a deal, really. Still, if your fighting style does not require the use of that part of a blade, might as well leave it unsharpened. Saves time, saves the blade in that area. So you can make arguments either way. You could even make arguments about differential sharpening in different sections of the upper half of the blade. For example, you could put a pretty fine sharp edge on about this section of the blade, because that's what you primarily cut with, and leave this a lot thicker and sturdier, because with the point you don't want to thin out the point too much, because then it might bend or break. So the point in and of itself arguably shouldn't be sharpened on a lot of types of blade. And this section here, again, you don't really cut with for the most part because it doesn't have enough mass. There are some types of blade where you can deliver a tip cut, so in that case you would handle that differently than this. But in this case you could absolutely just sharpen about this much and pretty much ignore the rest. So it really depends on the individual use and personal preference, of course. Even the same type of sword can be used in somewhat different ways, and so you can sharpen it accordingly. So yeah, as I said, for my purposes, definitely from about here to the center of the blade, nice and sharp. That's about it. Hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching and have a good one, folks. By the way, check out the links in the description down below.